Hey guys, welcome back. In the 11th lesson of the official Bolt series, we're going to set up our projectile object. It's going to be a weapon that we can shoot out and kill enemies if we were to hit them. In order to use our projectile, however, we have to collect the projectile item in levels that have a projectile, and we're going to update the UI to show that we do in fact currently have a projectile weapon equipped, and if we do have one equipped, we can shoot it and hit the enemies and deal damage to them. So to do that, what I'm going to first do is in level 4 here, where the first projectile is shown, on my player object, I want to create an object variable that's going to help me keep track of whether or not the player has the projectile. So if he does have the projectile, it'll be true. If he does not, it'll be false. That way we know, can we shoot it or can we display it in the UI and so on. So I'm going to create a new variable called hasProjectile. And this is going to be a Boolean, so right there. And by default, it will be false. We don't have the projectile until we collect it. And the way we're going to collect it is the same way that we collect the key pretty much. We run into the key, then we get the key. So if we look at that, we just check for the collision, set the has key to true, and then destroy the object. The exact same thing we're going to do for our projectile. So with projectiles pickup selected, I'm going to come over here, I'm going to add component, and I want to add a flow machine component, and I want to create a new macro. And let's call it Projectile Pickup. So this is going to be the graph that is going to handle the actual object that we collide with to get the projectile. We're going to have a projectile that we shoot out that'll be a different object, so we'll get to that here in a bit. So for this, I don't need either of these events because all I want to do is know if I collided with the player. So I'm going to take my on collision with and drag it over and drop it. And I'm looking for, once more, the player. So we're on the projectile pickup. So if that did in fact collide with the player, then I want to know that so I can say, okay, you now have the projectile. So I'm going to say set object variable, and the object variable I want to set is on the player that we collided with. So I'm going to pass that in as the target for that variable, and I want to set the variable of has projectile. And if we did in fact collide with it, so if we hit the target, we know we passed the flow into there, and I want to assign the value that is simply a bool literal true. And then once we do that, all we have to do is destroy the projectile object because we only want to create one projectile. We don't want to be able to collect multiple projectiles. So I'm going to say destroy, game object destroy. And the object that we want to destroy is going to be this object, right? The projectiles pickup, whatever the graph is on. So all we have to do for that is drag this out and type in self, just like that. That's referring to this object. So let's apply this change and let's test this out. Run into the object here. Boom. Go to the player, on object. I can see I now have the projectile. Pretty cool. That's all we need for now. Now let's set up the projectile object itself, the one that we're going to shoot towards the enemies. So if I go to my prefabs folder, I have a projectile prefab right here. And what I want to do is add another flow machine because we're going to actually write the graph now for the projectile object. So I'm going to create a new macro again here, and I'm going to call it projectile. Now this is going to be responsible for actually making the projectile move in the direction that the player threw it. So if we are facing to the right and we press the fire key, that means the projectile should move to the right at whatever speed we would set it as. And if we're looking to the left, we want to shoot the projectile to the left. So we're going to do that in the projectile graph. So for this, all we'll need is the start event, because all we have to do is whenever the projectile is spawned, whenever it is created or instantiated in our world, at the start, I want to make sure I just set it off in a direction. I want to add some force behind it and push it in one direction or the other. So we only have to do that in start. And to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set velocity on the rigid body 2D for this. And as you know, that allows me to set the velocity, which is going to set the speed on the X or Y axis. All we care about for this is the X axis, right? We can't shoot up and down. We can only shoot left and right. Much like our player moves left and right and can jump, all we care about for this is the X axis. So what I want to do for that is create a vector 2 again, because we need X and Y value. So I'm going to say create vector 2, and I'm only going to be moving it on the x-axis. So what I'm going to do is keep the y at 0 because it's not going to be moving up and down. And the x value, what I want to do is I want to take the direction the player's looking, right? So that's going to be the direction we throw the projectile in. And I want to multiply it by a speed value, so we can just say how fast we want it to move, because the direction is going to be either -1 or +1. That's how the player's look direction works. You flip the scale. So I wanted to use that to multiply a speed value. So if I were to use a multiply unit here, and I want the one that allows me to put the value directly on the unit, so I'm going to use the one in scalar. So we have to know what direction we should move the projectile in. Since we don't know what direction the player is looking from this, what I want to do is I want to set up a variable on our projectile that from the player, whenever we create the projectile, whenever we shoot the projectile, we will assign a value to that variable that will then tell it which direction to move based on the direction the player is facing. So for now, I'm just going to say get object variable, and it's going to be direction. So this is going to be an object variable that we have set on the projectile object itself that the player is responsible for assigning a value to. And I'm going to take this, pass it into A, and now the B value is the speed at which the projectile should move. So if I were to say 8, that'll take 8, multiply it by 1 or -1, so it'll still be +8 or -8, and that's the speed it's going to move on the x-axis. And it's going to set that as the velocity on the rigid body 2D. And let's say we shoot this projectile out and it doesn't hit anything. Well, what's going to happen at the moment is it's going to keep just going forever, right? It's just going to keep on going, and we're always going to have that reference to that object. It's always going to be stored in memory. And what I want to make sure I do is if it doesn't hit anything, after a certain amount of time, just kill it, just destroy it and get rid of it in memory. So what we can do for that is I'll just say, take the flow out there and destroy, but now I want to do a destroy with the object and then the t parameter. And that allows me to define, as you can see down here, the optional amount of time to delay before destroying the object. So if I use this, I can set the time to be something like 10 seconds. So after 10 seconds, destroy the object, but which object I want to destroy? Again, I want to destroy self. So the projectile itself that we are actually on. So now it has 10 seconds of travel time before it will destroy itself. And that time, if it were to hit an enemy, will destroy the projectile as well. But we'll get to that here in a bit. Let's add a group to this. I'll call it launch. And I also want to add a rotation, just kind of to give it a little flair, so that whenever we fire it out, it's going to rotate kind of like a ninja star would. Something cool like that. And to do that, I'm going to rotate using the X, Y, and Z values. So it's transform rotate. It's going to allow me to define the rotation of the object. So what I want to rotate it on is the Z axis, right? So it's the axis going straight through my 2D game world. X and Y, X being horizontal, Y being vertical. Z is the axis going straight through the game world. So I want to rotate it on that axis, which is going to give it a rotation that we'll be able to see, kind of like a spin. And the Z that I want to rotate it on, let's just say we do this every single frame. That makes sense, right? So we're going to do it every frame. We're going to update the rotation, just like that. But if I were to throw the projectile to the left, I want it to spin like it's been thrown to the left. And if I throw it to the right, I want it to spin like it's been thrown to the right. So we're going to take the direction value again and use that to calculate the rotation direction. So I'll say again, get object variable, and I want to get the variable for direction. And we'll just again multiply this by however much we want it to rotate. So I'll say multiply, same one here. And I want to multiply it by something like 800. And you can play around with that value and see how fast or how slow you'd like it to rotate. And I can pass this directly into my Z angle. Now every single frame, that's going to update the value by however much that we rotate that frame. Now keep in mind, this is done every single frame. And you may know that my PC may run at 30 frames per second and your PC may run at 60 frames per second. So that means every single second, if you're getting 60 FPS and I'm getting 30, you're going to be spinning twice as fast. on your PC opposed to mine. In this case, rotation, not that big of a deal that it has to be the same on every PC, but if it was like movement speed or something along those lines, you definitely want to make sure that it stays the same no matter the frame rate, so make it frame rate independent. And one way you can do that is if I were to say something here called per second, that allows me to take a value and normalize it per second as opposed to per frame, then it will be the same no matter what your frame rate is. It will actually compensate for the frame rate differences. Pretty cool. Move this down here and again, add another group. I'll call it rotation. And now the last thing that our projectile needs to worry about is if it has collided with an enemy. If it has collided with an enemy, it should kill the enemy. If it didn't, it just goes off into space and eventually dies. So what we'll do is we'll again take our on collision with, because we care about whether or not this has collided with an enemy. Enemies will have an enemy tag. If I select this, I can see enemy has an enemy tag. So I'm going to check for that. And a couple of things I know I want to happen whenever this happens, whenever we collide with an enemy. So a couple of things I know I want to happen is if I hit the enemy, I want the enemy to die. So maybe fall off the platform, do a little spin and just kind of kill itself, right? And then I also want the projectile to be destroyed after it collided with the enemy. You hit one enemy and you're done. So first of all, I'm going to say destroy. And again, destroy with the object parameter there. And I also want to trigger an event on the enemy that will take it from the alive state to the dead state. So we have the state set up on our enemy. If I were to go into enemy here, we have alive and then we have dead. And I want to trigger this event here based on whether or not the projectile hit the enemy. So what I'll do for now is I'll just trigger that event, even though it doesn't exist yet. Then we'll come in here and set up the event. So I'm going to go back to my projectile and I'm going to say trigger custom event. And the event is called death. Just like that. So if we were to hit the enemy, target flow goes into the trigger custom event unit. And then out of that, we want to also go and destroy the projectile. We know we want to do that. So you hit the enemy, you call the death event, and then you also kill the projectile. Makes sense. I also want to destroy the projectile if I hit anything else. So if I hit the enemy, yeah, destroy the projectile. But what if I hit the ground? Or what if I hit, some kind of decoration or something? I want to also destroy the projectile for that. So pass it in just like that as well. And now the custom event that I want to trigger, the target for that event is on the enemy. So I'm going to pass that object reference in from the output of our collision unit, because if I were to collide with the enemy, I know that that will give me the reference to the enemy object. And again, the object to destroy is going to be self, as we are still on the projectile object. One more group here called collision. There we go. This is all we have for our projectile. Launch it in a direction, rotate it for a little visual flare, and then do something when we collide with an object. Pretty cool. So now we want to define the functionality for whenever we fire off the projectile. We're going to do this on our player controller. So what we want to do is whenever we press a button, in this case the fire button, which is a default Unity button, whenever we press that button, we want to instantiate the projectile object, which just means to spawn the object in the game world. And we want to do this if the has projectile variable evaluates to true. If it does, we're going to spawn the projectile. And we're also going to set the object variable on the projectile for direction to be the direction that the player is facing. And that's going to be enough to send it off in the proper direction. So let's quickly do this. I'm going to come down here in player controller. So to understand what we need, let's first add our instantiation here. So instantiate, and I want to add the instantiate from game object that has the original, which is the object, the position that we're going to spawn it at, and then the rotation to spawn it with. So I'm going to use that. So first of all, the object that we want to actually instantiate. What I want to do is instantiate the prefab that is the projectile, right? So that's where we defined all the projectile functionality so that it moves and it will fire off an event if it collides with the enemy and so on. So all I have to do is take this, drag it, and drop it right on that field. So now it will actually spawn the projectile object that we defined as a prefab whenever this unit is activated. The position that I want to spawn it at is going to be the player's position, and then player controller is on the player. So all I have to do is say get position from the transform there. That's going to get the position of the player object. And then for the rotation, I don't want a rotation by default. I want to have it set as 0, 0, 0 whenever it's spawned. And the way I can do that is I can say identity, and that'll give me quaternion get identity. And that will be just no rotation, 0, 0, 0. That's exactly what I want for that. So that's pretty much all we need to actually instantiate the game object. But I want to make sure I do this whenever the fire button is pressed and only if I have a projectile collected. So with the player object selected, if I were to come down to my object variables here and take has projectile, drag it out here, that'll allow me to get the value. And remember, by default, it is false. But whenever we collide with the projectile pickup, it'll be true. And what I want to do with this value is if we do in fact have the projectile and we also hit the fire button, I want to say instantiate the game object. I want to say on button input. That's going to allow me to define the name of the button. In this case, it was fire 1. That is the name of the button defined by default in Unity. If we go to edit, project settings and input, go to axes, I have fire 1, fire 2, fire 3. Fire 1 is left control or mouse 0. So fire 1, whenever it is pressed down, and if we have projectile, so we know to do that, I'll just use a branch here. And that's going to allow me to define a conditional, pass the flow in if it was true. So if we did in fact have projectile, whenever the flow is passed into the branch here, I want to instantiate the game object. And now, as you know, all we have to do is set up that direction variable that is defined on the projectile. So I'm going to say set object variable. It was an object variable. And the variable is on the projectile object that we just instantiated. So the target for the variable is in fact the projectile prefab that we just instantiated. And then pass the flow straight from the instantiation into the set variable. And the variable that I want to set is the direction. So the direction that we're going to actually be shooting the projectile in. Now again, I want this to be the direction that my character is facing. So how can I do that? I know that we're using the scale to actually flip our player around. Set local scale. So all I have to do is get the local scale on the X value and use that as the direction. It'll be a positive one or a negative one. So I will say get local scale. And from this, I want the X value. All I care about is the X value. So get X and then pass that in as the value to set the direction variable too. So now I have a positive one or a negative one set on the direction for the projectile whenever it is spawned. Pretty simple to do once you get the hang of this. So I'm going to just drag out another group here and I'm going to call it spawn projectile. So now if I were to test this, let's collect the projectile and let's fire. Choo. Pretty cool, right? And we'll watch them all slowly die after 10 seconds. So now what I have to do is make this actually, notice I hit the platform and it destroys. The enemy destroys the projectile as well. But you're probably noticing the enemy's not dying. He just kills our projectile. So what I want to do is set up the death transition for our enemy. So let's do that now. So now on our enemy state graph, we want to set up the dead state. And the dead state is going to handle what happens when the enemy dies, obviously. And what I want to happen is I want the enemy to stop moving. So if he's walking, he stops. I want him to fall through the ground. So we're going to disable his collision. I want him to kind of fade out a bit, you know, get a little more transparent. So he looks like he's kind of turned into a ghost and falling through the platform. I want him to add a little spin. So he falls and kind of like rolls into the depths below. And I want to just destroy the object after a certain amount of time to clear up those resources. So we'll do that in the dead state here. So double click on that. And all I care about is whenever we enter the dead state. I don't care about every frame during the state. I don't care about what happens when we leave the state, because this is the last state the enemy will be able to go into because, well, they'll be dead. So now I said I want to do all those things. And the way we can do that is using something called a sequence. We can lay out the order that things will happen with a simple unit called sequence. So we can say, well, the first thing that happens is they stop moving. The second thing that happens is they fall through the ground. The third thing that happens is they, you lower the alpha on the sprite. So I'll set this to something like 5 so we can have 5 different things that happen. The first thing being the movement stops. So I'll drag this out and I'll say set velocity on the rigid body 2D, and I'm simply going to set it to be 0, 0, so we're not moving X or Y. I then want to make sure that they can fall through the ground, and to do that I'm going to simply disable their collision. So I'm going to say box collider 2D, and I want to go down and find set enabled. That's going to allow me to enable or disable the object collider. So I'm going to set that, and it's going to be set to false, on, off. So we're going to make sure it turns off the collider whenever this happens. I then want to set the sprite color to be more transparent. So I'm going to say sprite renderer, and I want to set color, and I can do this directly on the unit. Pretty cool. I just want to drag down the alpha channel a bit here, make it a bit more transparent. The next thing we should do is make sure that if they were walking and they were playing the walking animation, that when they're falling, they no longer play the animation. It would make no sense to play the animation while they're falling. So I want to make sure set float on the animator for speed to 0. So speed is what determines whether or not we're playing the walk animation. So if we set that to 0, then the walk animation will not play. And then, like I said, I want to destroy that game object. So drag this down and again say destroy game object with the time parameter. And as you know, self, and the time parameter will be something like 5. So when they die, can't move, fall through the platform, make it more transparent, make sure the walk animation is not playing, and then 5 seconds later, destroy the enemy. And also, while they are dying, while they're falling, we want to make sure that the object is spinning to give it just another visual flair. So I'm going to add, again, rotate. And we're going to do this the same way we did for our projectile, except I don't care about the direction because it doesn't matter. So I'm simply going to take per second and say we'll do it something like 720 per second on the Z. And we're going to do this every single frame, so in update. So pretty much the exact same thing, except we don't care about the direction. And now the last thing we have to do on our enemy is, if we go back to our state graph here, I want to transition from alive to dead whenever that event is fired off from our projectile. So I want to go into this by double clicking. Trigger transition is going to happen if a custom event is fired off that is called death. That is the event that we're triggering from our projectile. So when that happens, we're going to transition to death. Very simple. Go back out here, and I'm going to call this death. And now let's test this out before we get to the heads up display bit. So I collected the projectile, and now it's fired at this enemy. Boom. That was pretty cool. Let's try it again. And the last thing I want to do is add the icon to the heads up display if we have the projectile. If we don't, simply don't show an icon. So that way you know if you have the projectile equipped or not. So to do that, we're going to go into our heads up display scene. So save this scene, go into here. Under row here, we have projectiles. And like we did for the key and for the hearts, I'm going to add an embedded graph here for the flow machine. Change it to embed. That way it is simply only on this when it's embedded straight in the machine. We don't care about it elsewhere. And I am going to, every single frame, so get rid of the start. We're going to do it like we did the key, except we don't care about showing the empty version and the full version. We're simply going to only show the projectile if we have it. If we don't, disable it entirely. So I'm going to say image. And again, I want to find the set enabled. So set enabled. Pass that in every single frame. We're going to be checking for this. And it's going to be true if we have the projectile and false if we do not. So I want to get the application variable that we have that's called player. So it's going to be a reference to the player object. And then on player, I want to see if the player has the projectile, right? So get object player, or get object variable on the player object. So I'll pass this in as the target for the variable. And I'm looking for has projectile on the player object, right? So if we do have it, set it to true. If we do not, set it to false. So simply set it to the value of the projectile variable. So if we have collected it, then we'll show it in the UI. Let's try this out by saving the scene, going into level 4, and clicking play. So there's no projectile icon in the UI. Get it, and there it is. And that is it for this lesson. We now have a projectile system set up for our little character. In the next lesson, we're going to set up the pause menu that we have disabled. We're going to set this up to work whenever we want to pause the game. We will talk about that in the next lesson. My name is Austin, and I will see you there.